agenda in a way that wasn't then is the possibility of big power conflict. And most people would have said, 20 years ago, you're never going to end up with another war in Europe, and we've got a war in Europe, and a war that's being fought in a particularly brutal way. And yes, there is a sort of strange type of club or alliance with Russia, Iran, North Korea, and with China, obviously the dominant player, with strong associations with those countries, even though personally I believe that Chinese will set a lot of limits to their engagement with those countries.
But in 2001, the major threat was seen as Islamist terrorism, and at that time you regarded Putin as an ally in the fight, and you wanted him to have a seat at the top table. Was that a mistake?
So one of the questions I always ask myself is, was he always like that and we didn't notice it, or did he change? I tend to think that he did change, because, of course, when I came to office, the G7 wasn't the G7, it was the G8.
And Glen Eagles, he was standing right beside you, Glen Eagles.
Absolutely, but this had been all part of the change in politics after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Both Yeltsin and Putin used to come to NATO gatherings, and there was a partnership with them. So it was a very different situation in those times. And of course, we did have a common fight against terrorism. So obviously what happened over time was that, first of all, he started to remove a lot of the democratic constraints in Russia, and Russia stopped becoming a proper democracy. And then, of course, although this happened after I left office, he started to act aggressively. Although even then, I have to say, I think myself and anyone who dealt with him were genuinely shocked by what he did in Ukraine in 2022.
But there were warnings in papers released by the National Archives that you were warned about whether he could be trusted back in 2001.
Well, yeah, there were always warnings as well. He could be trusted, but but no one was saying he was about to launch a major war in Europe.
But then what you had was the expansion of the EU eastwards and in the Baltics, and that was seen as a threat. He saw that as a threat.
Well, the problem was, and this is when I began to realize we were going to have a significant difficulty with them, is that my attitude was always, and the attitude of any other Western leader, was it's up to these countries to decide their future. So if they want to join the European Union, they want to come into NATO, that's their choice. And I remember having a specific discussion with them over Ukraine, where I was saying, look, we've got no strategic interest, we're not going to try and pull Ukraine towards us, we've got no strategic interest in causing difficulties, but obviously in the end it's a decision for the Ukrainian people. And his attitude was it isn't. They're part of our sphere of influence. And I think the problem...
And at that point, did you realise that we were in for trouble?
I certainly realised that this was going to be much more difficult, and that's why things became more difficult with him towards the end of my time in office. But as I say, at that point, it was a disagreement about our expansion of NATO. It wasn't a threat of military action.
But now we are faced with horrific developments in Ukraine just even this week. Is the West on the front foot enough in support of Ukraine?
No, I think we've got to be doing more. Look, in the end, if there's going to be a settlement of the Ukrainian conflict, the only settlement that's going to be acceptable is one in which Russian aggression is not rewarded, and that means the Ukrainians have got to be given the means and have the strength to make sure that whatever agreement ends the conflict is an agreement that's on good terms. This is not going to end in the way that the First World War or Second World War ended. It will end in an agreement, but we've got a much better chance of getting a good agreement if we're giving Ukraine everything they need.
Just on the question of the US election, because a poll for CBS at the end of June, 72% of registered US voters do not believe that Joe Biden has the mental or cognitive health to serve as president and indeed obviously as commander-in-chief. And I wonder, is the best chance for a Democratic win to think about a new candidate?
Yes,
Okay.
You know,
I've got to try.
yeah.
I've got to try, right? I'm going to come.
Definitely not getting into that.